if you had a fuel that basically was spewing out cyanide and you had a not alternative that's like, you know what we should probably do? We should probably not spew out cyanide. Then like you might understand why a government could, you know what, we're gonna stop spewing out cyanide. Well, we're back for the now the heat's back. I don't know what's happening. Well, I'm Richard Delavan. We're back here at Wicked Problems, Climate Tech Conversations, and today's episode comes in the wake of one of the most urgent and hopeful calls yet on the climate crisis. At the Global Tipping Points Conference, nearly 200 leading scientists and experts in Exeter issued a stark warning to world leaders ahead of COP30: act now or risk triggering irreversible climate cascades. But in the same breath, some of them pointed to something else. Stephen Smith called a positive tipping point. And Stephen joins us now to explain what that means, how close we might be in the UK, and what it will take to make the leap from risk to momentum. Stephen, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Richard. Great to be here.
So, looking forward to this conversation for a while, and so it's been a couple weeks to digest some of the things that came out of that conference in Exeter, which I'm really sorry I missed. I would love to have been there, but it does sound like it's been a particularly consequential conversation this year. But just like take us a step back for the the folks in the back there in the audience. What is a tipping point for the climate?
Yeah, great question, Richard. So a tipping point, it's a pivot point, I guess, in a complex system, and that system has to have alternative stable states where. So the point it's where a small additional change can make a big difference to which state the system will remain in. So if you think of the complex system as you sitting in your chair, for example, you're in one stable state in that chair, and a different stable state would be you and your chair flat on your back on the floor. Now, let's say for legal reasons, let's not try this at home, but imagine leaning back on your chair until you're balancing on the back legs, and it takes a lot of energy to push from your feet, let's say, against the wall to get you to that point. But once you're there, it only takes a little sort of toe poke to send you past that point of no return, crashing to the floor, and that's the tipping point. It's the point at which even a little toe poke can make a big difference.
I think that this is something that people like, again, no matter what field of endeavor, right? Whether it's economics or it is climate science or it's other things, humans tend to think about linear kind of change, right? We think about these graphs that go up and to the right and like a normal kind of XY graph of blah, 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 blah. And systems tend to not like disequilibrium. Like they like systems where it's like there's a certain amount of stability for at least the time being, where things kind of keep going on their own. And so I want to get to like what the counterpoint is of that, because there's a kind of good news version of that in some respects, which I think you wrote about in the conversation, but also there are some the bits that we would normally be referring to when we talk about that. And one of them, yeah, things like, so what would be examples perhaps of something that on the perhaps the downside when it comes to that like moment where that chair tips over because of that extra poke of energy when it comes to the climate system?
Yeah, so most of us have heard of tipping points in relation to the dangerous, scary stuff that we want to avoid if at all costs. So things like the melting of the ice sheets, or the dieback of the Amazon rainforest, or the shutdown of the Atlantic circulation that gives us our warm, temperate climate. So those are the climate tipping. Well, we call them really Earth system tipping points. Is what we usually call them, and so the dangerous ones we really don't want to happen, as opposed to the positive tipping points, on the other hand, which are the ones that we definitely do want to happen because we need them to accelerate the change that we need to get a new renewable energy based low carbon economy. So in time to stop global warming and to avoid crossing these dangerous tipping points.
And I come back to like again, it's a psychological phenomenon as much as anything else, right? The idea that we we are used to thinking about things like this, humans, right? Particularly if you take like kind of middle school trigonometry or whatever, but and some Cartesian kind of graphic stuff. But we struggle with this idea that there are these kind of asymptotic limits in systems that tip over. So, is this something though that has caught on with some of the people who really matter, in particular policymakers? Because again, if like you look at IPCC stuff, or you look at like I don't know Morgan Stanley or Swiss Re or whatever, and many of them have that like up and to the right, kind of graph. Very few of them actually have models that point out that like, oh well, if X then Y then Z, and the Z is like woo curly Q in terms of the graph. Do you think that policymakers have started to actually get to the point of a better point of understanding about even this basic concept of a tipping point?
Yeah, well, it's certainly not happening as quickly as we'd like, but certainly the attention is now being drawn as we see these tipping points being crossed, and the usual, as you say, linear sort of gradual progress taking place. Sorry, can we stop just for a
It's
second?
okay.
I've got
It's
someone right
okay.
at the door. Sorry.
It's okay. It's okay.
Sorry about that, Richard.
Oh,
UPS
you're
could
grand.
have could
No,
have
no.
UPS could have been here any time all day, and they chose right now.
And what it's always the way. I mean, in my dog sit usually can find any time at all to go off one of the three, and usually they do this, and they usually keep some of this stuff, some of it in, because it assures people it's not AI, because
Yes.
AI is not that good just yet.
Yeah.
Not yet, but like they'll probably be training on this when they see it. Anyway, doesn't matter. Okay, well, if you're ready to continue, or do you need a minute?
Yeah, and that's fine. Yeah. So as you say, policymakers are really starting now to catch on to this idea and to take it seriously. However, we have this very long history of thinking about change in quite slow, incremental, linear ways. And as you say, all of our financial systems and legal systems and the way that our governments plan for things does base itself around these linear processes, which do work for most of the time until they don't, until things don't happen slowly. They start happening all at once, and that's what tipping points are. And in short, it is something that we really need to make politicians and policymakers and people who run financial institutions change the way they do things, because these tipping points are, some of them are now very close, and if we don't take them into account in our risk management, we really are risking an awful lot of a lot of people's lives and a lot of people's livelihoods.
And, I mean, that seems to be like one of the if there's one key central message from the statement coming out of the conference that you guys had staged in Exeter, and I know you're not the only person who was involved in leading it, but I wonder if maybe I'm on the right track or not. But it does feel like if there was one statement that you wanted people to take away from the message that people signed on to, as the output from that conference, is that, there, without immediate unprecedented action, that there are these tipping points. And yeah, we'll get to the positive ones in just a sec. But I think, we're heading into a year where lots of stuff has happened. We've just had this International Court of Justice ruling. We're headed into COP 30, which is the 30th chance to at least even talk about the problem candidly, which we seem to have trouble doing for the last 30 odd years. So, can you maybe recap for us, what the message was coming out of Exeter in this year's conference?
Yes, as you say, the key message from the conference is that we really need to get serious about taking immediate and unprecedented action to keep fossil fuels in the ground and decarbonize our economies, and restore nature so that we can get back to a stable, sustainable living planet. And of course, this isn't just the tipping points message isn't just a framing. It's a serious and detailed and growing body of scientific evidence that demonstrate what this genuine risk is that threatens the lives of billions of people and future generations. So, and despite the fact that the tipping points as a topic, it received more votes than any other topic to develop into an IPC special report back in when we published the first Global Tipping Points report in COP28, such as that level of concern, or despite that level of concern, it still isn't part of the formal negotiations of COP30. Governments still have no logic or method or framework for discussing these risks, and the clock is still ticking, and global emissions aren't yet falling, and small island nations are, slowly disappearing. Millions are suffering already, and we know about the billions of dollars of damage, and entire regions and categories of assets are becoming uninsurable, which means they're becoming uninvestable. It's a really serious and pressing issue that we really need to get into the next. If we can't change the negotiating themes for this COP, but we can certainly get them into the next one in COP31, and we really need to pay attention to this issue and get it part of the NDCs, get it part of the global stocktake, and make it part of our efforts to restructure the way that we govern the international institutions as well.
Let me again, let me be very unfair to you, Stephen, about something, and let me just lay on you a scenario that my understanding about what you just said, and apply it to a real world case that we've seen play out over the last couple of weeks. Right. So last Friday, and the results, as far as I'm aware, have not been revealed just yet, but the Australian government was meant to pick 280 names out of a hat out of the 80% of the population of the small island state of Tuvalu to apply for, resettlement visas in Australia as a result of a treaty that recognizes that the impacts of climate change are going to result in the uninhabitability of that small island state with a population of, I can't remember, 12,000 or something, but not a huge amount. But last Friday, first of its kind in the world, names out of a hat, 280 out of a population where basically 9,000 people tried to apply for these visas, which is kind of just a heartbreaking statistic in and of itself. But part of the reason why you would even be considering doing something like that, knowing why the, kind of the PR media aspects of it would be that it might actually put the frighteners of people, is the fact that at some point, if you're in some of these low-lying, small island states, or you're in other conditions where, as you mentioned, it either becomes uninsurable or uninhabitable for other reasons, um, at some point, policymakers and other institutions have to make a decision where it's like we are no longer past the point of, we're no longer in the zone of viability for this thing, whatever it is. Um, and for understandable reasons, policymakers are generally very, 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 very reluctant to acknowledge that, because it means that it triggers responsibility to do something about it. So am I right in thinking that that's part of, again, as a layperson, two lay people talking about the policymaking aspect of this, why it's been so difficult to get that on the agenda? Because once you acknowledge that there are points of no return on certain aspects of systems, then, again, in not in geological time maybe, but certainly in human scale, life, times, that just magnifies the difficulties, right? Because otherwise you're talking about, otherwise you're trying to explain to people like, sure, we could build you a seawall, right? But if in fact the seawall is going to be overwhelmed in another 20 years after that, it doesn't make any sense to do that, because of the fact we know this much energy is now built into the system. We've passed this particular tipping point, and therefore, it doesn't matter how high we build the seawall, how much money we spend. It's like your island's gone, bro. I mean, is that kind of that's a really hard conversation for anybody. So I'm sorry if I'm being glib and laying it out that way, but is that kind of what we're talking about? Is that why this is so tough?
It's a great question. I mean, the reasons why it's so tough for people to take tipping points into policy consideration and into government planning considerations is manifold. It starts with human nature itself, and our really we're not very well disposed to thinking about the long term, or about things of enormous magnitude, or things of that aren't immediate and present and personal right now. So that's the first thing, is that we're just not very good at doing this sort of stuff. The second is obviously the cost, as you say. Unfortunately, I mean, it shouldn't be that insurmountable to spend. I think it was maybe up to 1 or 2% of global GDP to really solve everything. It doesn't seem a lot considering we spent, a lot more than that on the COVID pandemic and the, various wars and so on. And this is more potentially consequential than any of those things. But unfortunately, it's not sane people who are running the world, it's economists. So, we have to change the mindsets more than anything else of how risk is assessed, and hopefully try to include more of the population, the general population, who are much more aware and demanding of radical change than the politicians realize. We're in this sort of weird Mexican standoff where the politicians are saying, well, I don't get people knocking on my constituency office door, hundreds by the hundreds every week, clamoring for change, so it can't be that important to people. And people are saying, well, if it was that important, surely the politicians were already doing something about it. And so we have to break this silent standoff and get people together in a more sort of honest, democratic conversation.
I see we need Quentin Tarantino to direct a film from Club 30 to really dramatize this. That makes sense. So look, I wanted to also bring you on because you co-wrote a piece for The Conversation. We're big fans of the outlet, which actually then, so to give people a little less, like, we're more less doom, is the fact that they're, systems, as we were talking about at the beginning, you know, moving from one semi-stable status in equilibria to another, it's not always in a direction that is horrible and destructive. Sometimes things do move in a direction where it takes on a life of its own. And I mean, like some of the listeners might be familiar with, Thomas Kuhn's, Structure of Scientific Revolutions, right? Paradigm shift, and what Oreskes, Naomi Oreskes has done with that since. And like the idea, like sometimes there's in human systems, we come up with this idea, and some people have, it's a really radical idea on the fringe, and then like you get some adoption, and then suddenly everyone was always in favor of that to begin with. Like you'll never find anybody willing to admit that they were ever against it.
Yeah.
And you were pointing to things that seem to be candidates for that in your conversation piece. Tell us about that. Positive pinpoints.
Yeah, so, well, basically any sufficiently complex system that has got more than one stable state, whether it's part of a natural sort of Earth system or part of a man-made part of the Earth system that we usually call social systems, they can all have tipping points. We normally look at these negative natural tipping points, but there are tipping points in social systems as well. So negatively, you can think of a civil war or a breakdown in peace as a negative tipping point at the social scale. But what we're trying to focus on here is the positive social tipping points that can happen in as we transition rapidly from a fossil fuel based economy to a renewable one. And so the idea is that we need to focus on those sort of self-amplifying feedbacks that generate the positive tipping points. And so we're looking at things like economies of scale and learning curves and social contagion effects and all these things which are part of the normal tipping points lexicon and framework, but applied to things that we want to promote rather than things that we're trying to prevent.
Can you drill down maybe on an example to make it more understandable? In particular, we're both based here in the UK, although the audience who'll be listening to this is worldwide. So, can you give us an illustration, an example that might illustrate your point in some detail?
Yeah, so the idea is that, well, let's take, for example, the renewable energy industry. Now, for decades, solar power and wind power were thought to be that they will never exceed a fairly low percentage of the energy mix because, solar power was so expensive and wind power, we have this abundant, sort of cheap, relatively cheap fossil fuel energy, which of course the cost of that wasn't, the environmental cost wasn't internalized in the first
Right.
place. But over the course of certain decades, leading markets like, for example, in Denmark with wind power or in Norway with electric vehicles, various policies were put into place, often led by fairly pioneering vanguard social movements and political advocacy groups, which attempted to change the balance of power, if you like, between these cheap fossil fuel energy products and the alternative renewable energy products. And because solar panels are very standardizable and modular and can be mass produced, there were these feedbacks over the course of a couple of decades that took place whereby the cost of making solar panels kept plummeting and kept sort of the performance of them kept doubling every decade, but also the cost of them kept reducing also every decade. So we eventually got to that point where there was cost parity, and then below cost parity for these key modular mass-produced things like solar panels, such that now solar energy is the cheapest source of energy on the planet in almost all countries,
Yeah.
and rapidly
And like,
getting the way of the wind energy is also rapidly going that way. Battery power also going the same way. It's this plummeting of costs and non-linear acceleration of performance that is really changing the way that energy is produced and used.
I suppose that, we also see this happening on the applications side, if that's the generations side, if we want to call things like electric vehicles, the kind of application side where you're going to, take very aligned technology, particularly on battery. When you're talking about storage, you're almost, often using the same kit to be able to charge up your car that you would be like a really big version to be able to like store the electricity from solar that you're not going to use during the day to use it at night at utility scale, at a much micro scale for the car. And, like EVs, like sure, there's like the noise and the data, but the direction of travel still is actually pretty robust. And I think your piece in the conversation, which we'll link to in the show notes, deals with that. But there does seem to be like, some weird artifacts where humans seem to be able to kind of throw some sand in the gears, if I'm not mixing my metaphors too badly, when it comes to like how, some of these things do change. And one of those things about like heat pumps, like you call that out in the piece in the conversation, I believe, as being a kind of exception, or rather a, where we're a little bit further behind. So, why do some things move faster towards their positive tipping point and others, lag maybe?
Yeah, I suppose you can. There's that familiar. We're doing a lot of metaphors today, but the idea of low-hanging fruit.
Yeah.
There's certain low-hanging fruit which we've pretty much all used up now. So when you're talking about pure commodities like electricity, people don't really care where the electricity come from as long as it's cheaper. They don't mind too much, and it's no skin off my nose to change to a renewable power provider as long as the electricity comes into my plug socket. There are other things that require more effort, more commitment, and have more sort of costs and burdens. For example, with heat pumps, they're not only more expensive, but in certain countries, like out in the UK, we're operating under a system where we have very high cost of of electricity,
Electrons. Yeah.
and it's really quite inconvenient to, in many cases, to install these things. So we have to, sometimes re-engineer our radiators and heating system, and get all the stuff out of our loft that's been there for 10 years, and it's quite a big hassle. So overcoming the hassle factor with heat pumps is quite a lot. And then there's all the business of training and reskilling people who have been used to just doing nothing but reinstalling boilers for the last 30 years or 20 years, and we haven't up to now been very very clever and future oriented in our education and training skills. So lots of different elements of the jigsaw puzzle have to be in place, including the skills and the training and the incentives for people to do it, and the upfront cost. All of these things have to happen at the same time before people are prepared to make that big decision to go a different way.
Before I come to the final segment, which I want to talk about some like what accelerates some of those changes, I guess the just talk about one last thing to get your perspective on it. It seems to me that one of the other things that is underappreciated, certainly from a policymaker perspective, are again, it's sort of harking back to the thing we talked about at the beginning, this like moments of rapid change of equilibria to a new state, right? And I think about this when it comes to like stranded assets. So if
Yeah.
you've spent billions of pounds and over the decades to build up a system where you can put pretty much safely, remarkably safely, like the safety rate to get methane into people's homes is actually remarkable when you consider how volatile it is as a gas compared to some other things. Like, like it's amazing how safe it is to me. And so the idea that we are going to, move to something else means that at some point, if we encourage this, which, for the best will in the world, best reasons, but if we hadn't taken into account all the people who spent all this money investing to keep that network up to date, right? And then at some point, we're planning its obsolescence, because we want the change to succeed, but we don't have an open conversation about that, with the people who are like trying to put another 60-year bond issue up to maintain the network. You can suddenly have these really rapid disjunctures where someone says, like, well, why am I going to put another 60-year bond issue up to be able to maintain, fix the network, or do this, or X, Y, or Z? Or it's supposed to sell it off for, for buttons. And those type of things seem to be like we're kind of getting it now, but certainly like in my wide-eyed techno-utopian days, a few couple of years ago, I would been like, oh, I hadn't thought of that. So I forgive, policymakers for not necessarily getting there right away, but it does feel like that's one of the things that holds us back. Is like yeah, the more downside, the more stakeholders that exist who are going to be the losers in a potential transition, then the more reasons they're going to have to want to find reasons to slow it down. Am I wrong?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's one of the key reasons for blockages and for I mean, not just for politicians, but as you say, for people sitting in insurance offices or finance or
Yeah.
banks or whatever. That who's going to be the first to stand up and put their head over the parapet and say, look, this is not sustainable. Let's change position here. I mean, the
Because
first movers.
the asset's completely, completely
Yeah,
junk at this point, or will be in 5 years.
yeah. So and of course, the longer you leave that, the worse that the correction is going to be, and it's one of those many social dilemmas which have to be collectively solved, which very few people have the courage or the commitment. And as you know, it all boils down to our leadership in the end. And often our leaders are on fairly short tenures, and it's not in anybody's individual interest to make that call and to take that severe punishment that they won't get re-elected and so on.
In the piece of the conversation, this is what I want to come to in our final bit here is, you in the piece, as well as some of the things that, you writing and came out of the conference, there was a discussion around like what does actually successfully accelerate change in some of these things towards positive tipping points. And maybe can you take us through some of your thoughts on that?
Yes, I mean some of the main the key concept, if you like, to remember here in the tipping points world is it's all about feedbacks.
Hmm.
So not all systems have tipping points, and it depends on many things. But the key one is all about feedbacks. So a feedback is like a closed loop in a system where an initial change can be either amplified and made bigger, which we call amplifying feedbacks, or where the initial change is dampened down and made even smaller, and we call those dampening or balancing feedbacks. So it's all about what can you do to maximize the amplifying feedback to create the change that we want to see. So the things that we focus on is how do we create those economies of scale? How do we develop those learning curves that massively reduce the cost of these new things that are now too expensive, but we want to be cheaper than the cheapest option, the most convenient option, the most accessible option. So we have to try and maximize those feedbacks that create the change that we want to see. And of course, the other one is just all about social contagion. Once things tend to happen in clusters. Once you see a solar panel on your neighbour's roof, you want one, and then all of a sudden you've got a whole neighbourhood that has them. So social contagion is another major thing that we want to try and promote. And as far as the actual policies are concerned, there is no substitute for initial government policy support for innovation, for R&D, and research and development, investment, and so on, giving the right tax breaks. But also we find that certain things are much more cost effective than other things. Like if you produce a mandate and say there will be no more fossil fuel powered or fueled cars being sold in this market after a particular date, that's so much more effective than just using, carbon taxation and so on, because it gives a very clear signal to the market, to investors, to manufacturers, where their future investment should lie.
Right. I mean, again, it's people try to, well, not to say try to, but often wind up in kind of tangled up in knots on some of these things where it's like if you had a fuel that basically was spewing out cyanide and you had an alternative that's like, you know what we should probably do? We should probably not spew out cyanide. Then like you might understand why a government could, you know what, we're going to stop spewing out cyanide. And that's kind of what we're talking about, but yet people find it hard to get their head around
Yeah,
these type
yeah.
of
It's the
things.
same
So yeah,
same thing with risk. If people say,
yeah,
well, there's only a 10% risk of the AMOC shutting down, which is going to wipe out agriculture across the entire Europe, and people say, well, 10%'s not a lot. But if you said, well, you got 10% chance of of an asteroid coming directly and destroying, a whole city, people would be throwing more money out at it than you can imagine to try to avoid it.
and certainly if you were, yeah, like if you were told yeah, the 10% chance you're going to have a fatal crash flying from London to New York, you might rethink whether or not that's a good bet, depending on
Yeah,
your life situation. Like that, particularly if your insurer was like, well, you knew, so we're not going to pay out on your life insurance because you're an idiot.
yeah.
So yeah,
There's a guy in the UK. Well, I won't mention his name because it's not my kind of guy. But there's a party who's talking about the huge costs of net zero,
hmm,
and it's the actual cost of the UK going to net zero is about £70 per person per year, and they're balking against this huge, vast cost of net zero. But we spend hundreds of pounds just on insuring our house every year, which
yeah,
has got one in like
or
5,000
Trident,
chance of catching fire.
yeah, or keep maintaining a nuclear, a semi-independent nuclear deterrent.
Yeah,
Um, and the submarine force or whatever else. Okay, so look, I mean, like this has been super helpful, and I want to make sure that we're, putting all the links in the show notes that what we've been just discussing. So, if there is a kind of positive tipping point when it comes to the narrative aspect of this, because I think it's something you touch on in the conversation piece. It's something that, the way we tell these stories. The longer I'm into this, the more I'm convinced is less about the technology and more about how we do, which is ironic, the comms, the storytelling, the ability to be able to get people to understand and buy into, and also understand why there are other actors who are telling different stories. Um, how do you see your role in helping to get people to tell stories that are taking these positive tipping points into account?
yeah. I mean, I love this area, and there's some great people. I think some of which you've already interviewed on this subject of how to make effective communications and tell the right stories. And it has to be all about telling a human story that makes people's heart sing or cry. And too often we talk about degrees above pre-industrial averages and you know parts per million of carbon, and no one care. I mean, people care when they think about it, but no one. There's no emotional reaction to those kinds of figures. So it has to be telling a human story, and I think connecting it with a kind of an engine room of policy advocacy. Like the great example recently was David Attenborough's film Ocean, in which they told this, even they were talking about a big industry like the marine bottom trawling industry, but they made it human by showing how there's little turtles and fish, and can you manage to get them to escape through the net? And it was just really heart rendering and heartwarming at the same time. So it's all about creating the stories that people can emotionally connect to, and then having a policy advocacy based around the film that was perfectly timed in that situation to appeal to community and political leaders and business leaders during an international conference at which they managed to ban bottom trawling in certain marine protected areas and so on.
And I think that is a very moving and very powerful example. So look, before we finally close, I mean, is there anything that gives you, in particular, hope? As you mentioned, this isn't the first time you guys have put out this tipping points report. It's not the first time you guys have staged an event like this. For people who are kind of at a different point in their journey, I hate that word, but like whatever, in terms of like understanding the situation that we find ourselves in, I find that some people find it difficult to keep going, and you guys do. So, any advice? People are just like just a friend of mine, not just saying. I'm not saying me, not at all, not me. Maybe a little bit me. Like how to get some advice. Like how do you stare into the abyss and yet keep going in the very hopeful and constructive way that you guys are doing?
I, I take. I just admire so many people who are trying so hard and risking a lot more than I'm risking to try to make this happen. I have my heroes that I look up to, and change happens, and at the moment there are some great things happening a lot faster than people would like to or imagine. As we've already talked about, the renewable energy revolution is happening. So many things are getting electrified, and the quicker we can make them electrified by renewable energy, the better. And that's 75% of the problem as far as climate goes. There are, other things like the food system. There is hope in the sense that there is a beginnings of a transition to plant-based and alternative diets, and that's another, major part of the problem, 20% or more. So there's hope in all quarters, and of course there's massive hope in historical examples of how fast, the abolition of slavery happened when we finally got together, how fast the civil rights movement achieved results, and how quickly we managed to ban smoking in public places when people thought, oh, that'll never happen. And there's lots of great examples that we can find hope. The marriage equality, acceptance of that. So that there's hope everywhere to be found. It's and the idea of giving up. What would I do? Go play golf? I don't think so.
Well, you could, but you might wind up running into Donald Trump. But you
Yeah.
might save us all by doing something radical there. Never mind, we won't
Yeah.
because it on air. Look, Stephen Smith, I'm really grateful that you could spend the time with us today. Really enjoyed this conversation. I hope you'll come back. And again, like we will definitely put links in the show notes. And I hope next year, if your comms folks deign to reach out to me to invite me down for the next Tipping Point conference, inshallah, then I will see you there.
Well, the next one hopefully is going to be in Indonesia, and then the one after that is going to be in Potsdam. So we better start going now if we're going to go by overland.
Well, I'm pretty sure I can get to Potsdam by train, so maybe that's one to
Okay.
shoot for.
Yeah.
Stephen Smith, thank you so much for joining us, man.
Thank you so much, Richard. All the best.
At my tipping point, bartender, won't you keep on pouring while I do a little swinging door and slow dance floor and get lit like a neon light.
Thanks for listening to Wicked Problems, made possible through the generosity of people like you. If you liked this conversation, please share it and leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It really helps people find the show. If you'd like an ad-free version of this podcast, consider becoming a paid subscriber at wickedproblems.earth. You'll also get our newsletter, all our show notes, member-only goodies, and you'll be supporting media that wants to tell the stories at the frontier of climate tech, the place where people and politics, technology and capital meet and shape the future. And whether it's one you'd want to live in. Wicked Problems is written and edited by Richard Delavan. Production assistance was provided by me, Theodore Delavan. Wicked Problems, Climate Tech Conversations, is a production of Wicked Problems Limited. Thanks again for listening.
Tipping